page 134, chapter 7, Lesbian/Gay Criticism, section Lesbian and Gay Theory, para. Lesbian and gay literary theory emerged prominently as a distinct field only by the 1990s. There is nothing about it, for instance, in Terry Eagleton's Literary Theory Cologne and Introduction, 1983, or in the first edition of Raman Selden's A Reader's Guide to Contemporary Literary Theory, 1985. As with women's studies 20 years before, the growing significance and acceptance of this new field is indicated by the presence of, quote, lesbian and gay studies, unquote, sections in many mainstream bookshops and publishers' academic catalogues, and by the establishment of relevant undergraduate courses, for which there is now a course reader, the Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader, published in 1993. There is also a relevant MA course, quote, Sexual Dissidence and Cultural Change, unquote, at the University of Sussex. The field is strongly multidisciplinary, with perhaps a predominance of cultural studies over literary material, para. But lesbian/gay criticism is not of exclusive interest to gays and lesbians, and it may be helpful in defining the nature of this field to make an initial comparison with feminist criticism. It is obvious that not all literary criticism written by women is feminist, that not all books about women writers are feminist, that feminist writing need not be by women, and that feminist criticism is not directed exclusively at a female readership. Likewise, books about gay writers or by gay critics are not necessarily part of lesbian and gay studies, nor are books that are part of this field directed solely at a gay readership or relevant only to gay sexuality. Page 135, para. What then is the purpose of lesbian-gay criticism? The Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader tells us that, quote, lesbian/gay studies does for sex and sexuality approximately what women's studies does for gender, unquote, this being described a few lines earlier as establishing, quote, the centrality of gender as a fundamental category of historical analysis and understanding, unquote, page XV. In lesbian/gay criticism, the defining feature is making sexual orientation, quote, a fundamental category of analysis and understanding, unquote. Like feminist criticism, then, it has social and political aims, in particular, quote, an oppositional design, unquote, page XVI, upon society, for it is, quote, informed by resistance to homophobia, bracket, fear and prejudice against homosexuality, bracket closed, and heterosexism, and to the ideological and institutional practices of heterosexual privilege, unquote, stop, para. Section Lesbian Feminism, para. However, lesbian-gay criticism is not a single unified body of work. There are differences of emphasis between lesbian and gay theory and two major strands of thinking within lesbian theory itself. The first of these is lesbian feminism, which is best understood by seeing it initially in the context of its own origins from within feminism, for lesbian studies emerged in the 1980s as a kind of annex of feminist criticism before acquiring disciplinary independence. Indeed, one reading of the academic situation in the 1990s would be that feminism had become so successful and so institutionalized that lesbian studies laid claim to the radical ground vacated by feminism. On this reading of the situation, feminism found it difficult to accommodate difference, whether racial, cultural, or sexual, and tended to universalize the experience of white, middle-class, urban, heterosexual women. This kind of critique of feminism originated in the work of African American critics who pointed out that academic feminism had reproduced the structures of patriarchal inequality within itself by excluding the voices and experiences of black women. This case is memorably put, for instance, in AINT, A-I-N''T, I, a Woman, Black Women and Feminism, Pluto Press, 1986, by Bell Hooks, first published in 1982. A similar accusation against feminism was made by lesbian critics. Feminism assumed, they argued, that there existed an essential female identity which all women had in common, irrespective of differences of race, class, or sexual orientation. Bonnie Zimmerman, page 136, among others, in a well-known essay, quote, "What has never been an overview of lesbian feminist criticism," unquote, attacked this essentialism, pointing out the way, quote, "the perceptual screen of heterosexism," unquote, prevented any consideration of lesbian issues in pioneering feminist writing. Page 180 in the reprinting of the essay listed at the end of this chapter. Hence, a feminist literary critical classic like Sandra Gilbert and Susan Guber's The Mad Woman in the Attic contains only a single passing reference to lesbianism. Para. Classic feminism then had marginalized or ignored lesbianism. This state of affairs was countered by arguing that, on the contrary, lesbianism should be regarded as the most complete form of feminism. This is argued in another crucial essay in the development of lesbian feminism, The Woman-Identified Woman, by the Radical Lesbian Collective, published in Radical Feminism, edited Annie Coed, Koedt, et al., Quadrangle, 1973. The lesbian feminist position identified in this essay makes lesbianism central to feminism, since lesbianism turns away from various forms of collusion with patriarchal exploitation and instead consists of relationships among women which by definition constitute a form of resistance to and a radical reorganizing of existing forms of social relations. Para. The conflict between heterosexual feminists and lesbians thus opened up and partly diffused in another important essay by Adrienne Rich, which introduced the notion of the lesbian continuum in her essay Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, collected in her Blood, Bread and Poetry, Selected Prose, 1979 to 1985, Virago, 1987. Indent opens. I mean the term lesbian continuum to include a range dash through each woman's life and throughout history dash of woman-identified experience semicolon. Not simply the fact that a woman has had or consciously desired genital sexual experience with another woman. Stop indent closes, quoted by Zimmerman in Green and Kahn's Making a Difference, page 184. Para. This concept of the lesbian continuum therefore designates a wide variety of female behavior, running for instance from informal mutual help networks set up by women within particular professions or institutions, through supportive female friendships, and finally to sexual relationships. Zimmerman comments that this definition, page 137, has the virtue of suggesting interconnections among the various ways in which women bond together. As Paulina Palmer, Palmer, points out, however, see Chapter 2 in her contemporary lesbian writing, seeing lesbianism in this way has the curious effect of desexualizing it, so that it becomes almost wholly a political act rather than a sexual orientation, and is hence sanitized and transformed into something else. Also, the corollary of the position is a moral condemnation of female heterosexuality as a betrayal of women and their interests, with the implication that women can only achieve integrity through lesbianism. Para. The two ideas of the woman-identified woman and the lesbian continuum overlap a great deal, but as ideas they have a clarity and flexibility which ensure their continued importance as personal and intellectual reference points. They introduce the notion of choice and allegiance into matters of sex and gender, so that sexuality is not seen as something merely natural and unchanging, but rather as a construction and as subject to change. Para. As a result of these critics, lesbian approaches separated from mainstream feminism throughout the 80s, but only in the 90s does lesbian criticism also reject the essentialism which had, so to speak, been inherited from feminism. Thus, when in quote, lesbians like this and that, some notes on lesbian criticism for the 90s, unquote, Zimmerman again surveys the field of lesbian criticism 10 years on from the earlier piece. What strikes her about her original essay is its assumption that lesbianism is a stable category, a, quote, transcendental signifier, unquote, which is just there as a fact, as a trans-historical constant, rather than as it is a late 19th century construct. In the 1990s, a second, less essentialist notion of lesbianism had emerged within the sphere of what is now known as queer, Queer theory. Section Queer Theory. So far, then, we have discussed the nature and development of the thinking designated as lesbian feminism. The second kind of lesbian thinking, designated liberation lesbianism by Paulina Palmer, breaks away from feminism and makes new allegiances, in particular with gay men rather than with other women, and this kind of lesbian theory sees itself as part of the field, quote, queer theory, unquote, or, quote, queer studies, unquote, page 138, terms increasingly used by gays in spite of the homophobic origins of the word queer as an abusive one in this context. These terms date, at least in their institutional acceptance, from the 1990 Conference on Queer Theory at the University of California, Santa Cruz. As we have said, queer theory in this sense, rather than being woman-centered like the lesbian feminism just described, rejects female separatism and instead sees as an identity of political and social interest with gay men. The key underlying question for anyone choosing between these two possible alignments is whether it is gender or sexuality which is the more fundamental in personal identity. Choosing the latter, of course, emphasizes lesbianism as a form of sexuality rather than a form of female bonding or patriarchal resistance. It tends to endorse experimental forms of sexuality within lesbianism such as sado-masochistic, SADO-MASOCHISTIC, and butch, BUTCH-femme, FEMME, role play. However, it is sometimes argued that one of the effects of accepting the comprehensive term queer theory is ultimately to perpetuate the patriarchal subservience of women's interest to men's.